Thank you all for inviting me. My name is Denise Harrison. I am a professor of English, and I teach for the English department in the Department of Pan-African Studies. Pan-African Studies is an activist program. And so we teach our students to not only get the grades in terms of the curriculum, but how do we take them out into the future and help their communities that they establish themselves in. And so we are always talking about how our students can be more engaging in their own academic life, but beyond their academic life to go into the world and make a difference. Coming from an activist background, I was first the child of a mom with 10 children who was always an activist. So I come from an activist background. I was pregnant with my first child and did a protest in which I was willing to be go to jail for in order for us to have people in our community who had people with handicaps to have access to getting around the community and to a store where we needed a major traffic light. That was my first big thing as a young adult. And so from there, I've always had in my background doing community service and activist work, going to first being a costume designer and builder for a university school of dance. And even in that school of dance, we were always negotiating around issues of race, class, and gender. And then from that, going to graduate school and getting my degree in English, really to always situate myself where I'm always telling stories, always creating works in which I'm looking at those issues. And even as I'm a paper crafter too, do paper making, cards and things. um, Race, class, gender, history, literature would always find its way into that work as well. As a costume designer, I also worked for the Cleveland Opera and the Cleveland Ballet simultaneously. And so my children were fed a diet of theater, art, and museums. And so we've always been connected, and it just makes sense that as I really woke up about 3 years ago and said, I really need to be an artist, to do something else. Um, but I would need to have a body of work if I was going to be an artist. And I wanted to do something with quilting because sewing was so much in my background that I needed 15 quilts to get me started. So I needed to make 5 to 3 a year. And then after that, I would be on my way. My husband had retired and he was asking me every day. He bought me a new car. He had a new car, but he would get up and go and take me to work. And I wanted him to find his own thing. And I said, look, I got at least 3 more years that I want to work. So in 3 years, you'll be able to take me all over the country to museums where my work is going to be. And so I started on the journey of building a catalog of work. My first piece is later in the presentation. It's a piece of Trans Lives Matters. And I'll get to that. That came out of a course that in Pan-African Studies, we taught a course on Black Lives Matters. And I wanted to do the part on trans lives because I really am grounded also in issues around LGBTQ plus communities. And it was really important that our students understand that their siblings are in this community and we cannot negate that. So with that, just brief background about me and my history and the road here, I'd like to get into this talk. And I'm, again, grateful that you've invited me, and I look forward to your questions either during the session or at the end of the session. So to start with this particular mask, I answered a call from the Women of Color Quilt Network. They had a mask challenge. I submitted 3 entries. my first entry was Harriet Tugman. So I selected Harriet Tugman for this mass because I was working on a piece on Black women as disruptors in the women's movement. And I had also had visited the Harriet Tugman home, her gravesite in upstate New York, in Auburn, New York. I taught a course called Seneca Falls, the intersections of race, class, and the crossroads of race, class, and gender. And in this seminar, students would learn how, because we were near a community of abolitionists, a lot of them were Quakers, they also were very instrumental in women having rights and a voice in the society. We visited Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home, Susan B. Anthony's home in Rochester, New York. We went all upstate, and Syracuse, visited various sites of women who had been contributors of the Seneca Falls 1848 Women's Convention. We visited the site of the 1816 Farmington Meeting House. This meeting house in Farmington, New York, was the site of a group of Hicksite Quakers who involved women in the leadership. They had had meetings, and it used to be that those meetings were separate. Men were in one room, women were in another room. Well, the Hicksites, the women said that the spirit moves us the same as the spirit moves you. And we don't think we should have to have our petitions taken to you first as men, and then to all the congregants. And the men agreed. And so from that point on, Hicksites were integrated men and women. They were active as free soilers. And so with them, there was a lot of movement in terms of not just the Underground Railroad, but Africans who had, African Americans who had escaped the institution of slavery would settle in those areas, and they would help them buy their freedom or maintain their freedom, help them maintain their freedom, educate them, give them places to do business, etc. So it's a really powerful location. The other important thing about the Hicksites in that area in Seneca Falls and upstate New York, the Seneca Nation, or the Six Nations, are located there. The Quakers polled the Seneca Nation to see if they wanted to sign the Trail of Tears Treaty. And after they polled them, it was a deciding vote of no. So they were also instrumental, some of them were instrumental in the sovereignty of Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations peoples as well. So when I talk about crossroads, all of this is coming together, and it makes sense that this would be one of the locations for Harriet Tugman to settle. So when I organized that trip, we went to various sites, we went to museums. Down the street from Harriet Tugman's home in Auburn is the Seward House. Seward was the vice president of Lincoln, and he actually sold Harriet Tugman the property that became her home. She had the first convalescent home for African Americans. Her first house became a convalescent home. Her second house, from her second husband, who was a brick mason, he and his brothers built her a house. And on the site in the grounds that was originally 15 acres of land, and is no longer 15 acres of land, but it was originally 15 acres of land, is her property, and it is now a part of the National Museums, the National Museum for this country. So Harriet Tugman, I had a lot of history with her. So I came to this and I'm thinking, what colors should I use? Well, at Harriet Tugman's gravesite in Fort Hill Cemetery, there is an American flag because, of course, she was in the military. She did military strategy for the United States government, and she was a strategist. And she also has there at her site an African flag. So it's red, green, and black. And that's right next to her gravesite. So both flags are there. And so it made sense that the colors would represent that part of her history. But also, I wanted to make sure that I address the fact that as the leader of of the Underground Railroad, she was really constantly talking to us about freedom, this place of liberty that didn't allow millions of Americans to be free. And she was one of those people who was saying liberty or death, and really putting herself on the line for that. So the first statement on is about her talking about she came into freedom, into the land of the free, and after she freed herself, but no one was there to greet her. No one was there to welcome her. No one there to acknowledge that. Oftentimes on the other side of the mask, you have a picture of the wanted poster for Harriet Tugman when she was 19 years old, this young woman. So we have to imagine escaping out of the institution of slavery as a 19-year-old young woman. And really, we know that she went back numerous times to gather family members and other people. And it was about 75 people who were freed during her travels back and forth. But that wanted poster for $300 to remit her back into the institution of slavery. And we know that after 1850, with the Fugitive Slave Act, um, no African American person was free in what we would call that area, the continental United States at that time, because in essence, that law rendered all territories as slave states. And so people were now fleeing to Canada to really ensure their freedom, because Canada did not um, participate in this, in slavery at this time. And the other thing is important is not that people wouldn't be affected by racism. They absolutely would be, because that same narrative that we have heard from centuries about Black people taking jobs, etc., encroaching immigrants, that narrative would happen in Canada. This is the same narrative that will happen in Britain as far back as Queen Elizabeth. When Elizabeth is answering a letter from the mayor of London, who is saying, you have to get rid of some of these Black people because they're taking all of our jobs. She writes a letter and suggests that they would trade their soldiers from Spain who are in prison in Spain for Blacks who are living in Britain. We don't know the number of those people, but we know that that in fact did happen. So London, Birmingham, and Liverpool were ports for enslavement as far as putting together the ships in England, because England came late to the institution of slavery, so they did not have forts on the coast of Africa. They did all of their work out of Britain. And so the same narrative that we hear there, we will hear as Harriet Tugman is freeing people, that once the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act comes into being, people are moving further north. And so the place of safety, or of ultimate safety for most people, will be Canada. So on the other side of her mask, I have a $20 bill, well, at the bottom. This really signifies the fact that she was part of this strategy to go into South Carolina, because she had traveled this territory on a clandestine um, war strategy to alert the Union that there was gunneries and as well as cannons in this area and explosives, so that as their ships passed along the river, they wouldn't be blown up. And she was able to help divert those American Union ships so that they wouldn't be blown up. But at the same time, over 700 Africans who were enslaved were free, Africans and African Americans. And I'll use those terms loosely because some Africans were not um, married into the African American community or born of African American families. If we go back a little further, someone like Benjamin Banneker, who was not mixed race, his parents were Africans. Sojourner Truth's parents were Africans. They were not mixed race and African American. So I use those two interchangeably. That's why you'll hear me say African and African American as far as people who were enslaved. So Tugman, when she came upon this strategy of alerting the Union of the bombs or the what do I want to call them, the explosives that were there, they were able to free other folks. And she said, and that's the bottom of the next slide, she said that they thought it was rain that was falling, but it was really drops of blood because they had been in battle. And they thought that it was the crops that they lost, but really what it was the dead men that they reaped. Because while this is happening, some people are not going to survive. It was colored in that term of colored as a antiquated term, but the term that was used during that time, it was a colored regiment that was with her. And this is a really significant note that in the cemetery where Harriet Tugman is buried, so is her second husband, who was in a quote color regiment. One of the unique things at the Fort Hill Cemetery is that they're all buried in the same cemetery. It was not segregated between black and white. However, there is a section of the cemetery that is for Jewish citizens. They're not mixed in, but they're in the same cemetery. So black, white, and Jewish is in this cemetery. It was a private cemetery originally. So the idea that, again, we're talking about how we segregate folks, that is part of the history in upstate New York as well, because in that cemetery, there's a section that is allocated for Jewish citizens, but at least is in the same cemetery. But I think we have to pay attention to how we divide ourselves against ourselves. So if I can see the next slide. Okay. Let me see if I need to tell you anything else about. Oh, can we go back to the Tugman slide just one more time? The $20 bill, I want to explain that. Harriet Tugman was slated to be on the $20 bill with the 2016, at the end of 2016, there seemed to be a lot of interest around the country from women, from people of color, to put someone of color or woman on a $20 bill. There were a lot of surveys by the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department came out and said that yes, a woman would be on the $20 bill. We had looked at Wilma Mankiller was a possibility. Susan B. Anthony, of course, was a possibility. And then Harriet Tugman. And Harriet Tugman was the one that across the nation, people said, yes, we would like to see her on the $20 bill. When the new administration came in 2017, they rescinded that and said that they would delay Tugman going on the $20 bill. And then they eventually just scrapped the whole idea altogether. The $20 bill with the 20 showing is the 1913 $20 bill. 1913 was the year that Harriet Tugman passed away. The folded $20 bill is a contemporary $20 bill, and it's there because we all had, and it's shaped in a heart with petals. We all had our hearts set on Tugman being on the $20 bill. I secured it with netting. I watched a demonstration of a woman reminding artists that legally we couldn't deface money. People do it all the time, but legally we couldn't do it. And if they wanted to, if the federal government, the Treasury Department wanted to make a statement, if we deface money, they could come out after us. So after I folded this calligraphy 20 this origami $20 bill, which took me 2 days to learn how to do, um, I put netting over top of it and then stitched it onto the mask. And so again, I use Kona fabric for all of my bright colors. In if it's a solid color in anything that I sew, it will be a Kona fabric because it holds up, is much more durable. Harriet Tugman in that dress on the front is more of what she would wear if she was going out. Of course, her hair was often tied up, as many African and African American women would have done in that time. Very difficult to keep your hair up. So traditionally, people would tie their hair up, and especially Black women who are in the fields. It don't make sense that you would have your hair down and you're doing field work. It wasn't until someone like Madam C.J. Walker comes along with her hair care products and straightening combs that Black women would actually start to really spend time doing their hair. We're talking about people who are living in the public as people who are working in the fields, and people who are in their private homes or whatever facility that you were allowed on a plantation, your shack on a plantation, as it were. Um, so there wasn't a lot of time to keep your hair up, and there wasn't product or techniques available, except that there were mixed race women who would have had a different kind of hair, and it was easier for them. But for us, when we think about the institution of enslavement 400 years ago, Black women coming from the continent here would not have had the items that they would have had access to, the kind of styles that they would have maintained. And it really, anything that signified your Africanness was removed as soon as possible in this system of enslavement. And I chose this picture mostly as a running costume for Tugman. There was just a new photograph found whereby she was in a day dress that would have been customary for someone during her time. So I made two other masks for this challenge. And this is my Black Suffragist mask. Um, Purple, white, and yellow were the colors of the Women's National Party. We're talking Alice Paul and Lucy Bruce. When they formed the party, they picked these colors for their flag. The picture on the side is of Ida B. Wells Barnett's Alpha Club that marched in 1913 in front of the White House to protest Andrew Wilson. Black women in the movement, there were quite a few. And unfortunately, that history it's not that it hasn't been available to us, it is that that history hasn't been talked about, because it's really easy today to find resources. And I would say Martha S. Jones' Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, as the best collection of works of all those Black women from various backgrounds who really fought for the right to vote. These Black women were willing to allow men, with the 15th Amendment, Black men were enfranchised to vote after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. But Black women were left out. So, and women were left out. Some white women, and probably the largest figures that we have, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these women really wanted Southern white women to join them in enfranchising women. And if that meant that they would leave Black women behind, they were willing to do that, because Susan B. Anthony, the one thing was just enfranchising women to vote. And it's always been this narrative that we will bring the rest of you along after we get our right, then we'll see to it that you're given your right. With somebody like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who had already escaped the most horrible of uh, situations of racism. She was on a train going from Tennessee to North, and when she came back from Chicago, she's told she has to sit in the quote colored cars, and she refused and she was thrown off the train. She actually sued that Tennessee train line. She was never paid. She won, but she was never paid. But at the same time, as a newspaper woman, she started writing about lynching across the South. And because she was writing about lynching across the South, her press was burned, her home was burned, and she ended up fleeing to Chicago. And in Chicago, she reestablished herself, and she formed these clubs for Black women called the Alpha Clubs. These Alpha Clubs were clubs of suffragettes. Black women were always under this guise where they could not be ladies, because according to American tradition, ladies didn't work in fields. And so they needed something to identify themselves as respectful women. So this kind of constructed code of respectability, that they were always doing things to show their respectability. They raised funds for their communities. They did activism work. They train Black women and boys on how to be good servants. All of these things was about that respectability. And so Ida B. Wells starts her Alpha Clubs, and there are chapters all over the country. And so these are the women lined up to protest along with Alice Paul and others against the president, President Wilson. Well, there were women who said that the only way this Chicago delegation could be in this protest, in this parade of women, is that they had to be at the back of the parade route. They had to be at the end. Originally, Ida B. Wells Barnett's group went to the end, but as soon as they start marching, she walked up to the front. And so she did not abide by those ideas in the South when she started writing about lynching after 3 of her friends, Black men, were lynched because they had a competitive store that African Americans used. And so the whites in their community burned their store and lynched them. And she wrote about it. And being forced to Chicago, where she had a little more freedom, she organized, and this organization, the Alpha Women, started. On the other side of this mask is a star, and that star is from a flag that was retired, an American flag that was retired. And I wanted to really signify that these are Americans. That flag means to us, that symbol of freedom is supposed to be our freedom. That, as Martin Luther King said in one of his last speeches, this piece of paper, Constitution, is supposed to include us. What about your piece of paper? What about your flag? That is, we're supposed to be included, and too often we're outside of it. So it was just a reminder that we are supposed to be under this banner, this flag that says that we're all Americans. Next slide, please. So I've already talked about the flag is from a retired American flag. You can go to the next slide. And then the Black Suffragists marching for the women's vote. And there were numerous groups across the country of Black women, North and South, that participated. In fact, when I started by talking about the 1848 Women's Convention, there was a Black woman who lived in Seneca Falls who had gone to a convention of women to talk about women's right to vote, but she didn't go to a convention in Seneca Falls. She went to another community. So she was absent there where Frederick Douglass was at that event, but there was no Black woman at that original convention. Next slide, please. This quote is from Mary Church Terrell, who's probably, she helped to start the National Association of Colored Women. She was one of the founding members. She also was a founding member of the NAACP. She was born a free woman to a Black man who had bought his freedom, and her mother had originally been an enslaved person. Her father earned a living and was able to move them into middle class. So she was born into a middle class family as a free woman, but she told us that her color, her race, really prevented her from doing things. And so originally she started talking about the combination of race and gender in terms of women and women's freedom. And so she tells us that that she was not welcome on account of her race. Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell by Allison Parker is a new biography of Terrell that gives you a really comprehensive history of her life. I highly recommend it. Next slide. This is the COVID mask that I made of linen. And in this one, I wanted to show the inequities of and health disparities. And so it's made of linen, and it kind of looks like an early nurse's cap in terms of the fabric. And then I just cut out the issues around the disease, around testing. This was early on because I think these were probably, I think the submission date was around July, and I started thinking of them early on, and I wanted to get a picture of the COVID virus itself. We have seen still those disparities are even more glaring when we look at the number of African Americans and Latinx folks who've actually gotten the vaccine. In communities where Black people dominate, they're only 6% of the recipients of the vaccine, where their white counterparts may be 40 or 50% of those who are vaccinated in any given community. Now, there are a couple reasons. There is this history in the African American community whereby we've suffered the indignities of the syphilis, denied syphilis treatment to the in the Tuskegee experiment. We had this doctor, I believe it's Dr. Sams, who did experiments, gynecological experiments on Black women, and said that they didn't feel pain as white women, and those experiments was done without anesthesia. We have a history of doctors not hearing Black people. We know the numbers of Black women who are suffering from death at the birth of a child has to do with racial disparities. So this mask was really to highlight those racial disparities. Next slide, please. and on there at the time this was done, that 47% of the COVID victims in the District of Columbia, 46% of the people in the District of Columbia were people of color or Blacks, and they were 76% of the deaths. And those numbers, by and large, have not changed in terms of what we're seeing. Underlying health issues in the African American community and other communities of color, the Latinx communities, high incidences of diabetes, heart disease. We're number one in heart disease, number one in diabetes, number one in cancers. There's a breast cancer that attacked Black women earlier in their lives and is much more aggressive. And so we really need to have more research. But again, there's a lot of fear based on how people have been treated in the medical industry to date. And so we really have to do more educating of communities of color, the value of this vaccine, the values of early diagnosis of diseases and treatment. And that's not going to happen until doctors are open and listening. Those disparities just won't change because we will them to be. We really have to talk about race and gender and class bias in the medical field of medicine. Next slide. And then this one shows you just the COVID virus, what it looks like. I have a log of quilts that are coming up, and I'm going to do a COVID quilt that just shows the virus and the virus's mutations. And I haven't figured out yet how the design will go, but I know I want to do one with that on it.